I'm never going to shy away from saying good news for the poor is often really hard news for the well-off. But I do think there's also an invitation for us, but not without soul searching, not without deep evaluation, and our own kind of Advent reckoning, maybe.
We picture this story situated amidst their original context. Abusive rulers and systems of oppression, economic hardship, political regimes that are out to wipe out entire populations. This is the context of the Advent stories in Matthew and Luke's Gospels, and these are some of the ways that Kelley Nikondeha invites us to read them anew in her book, The First Advent in Palestine: Reversals, Resistance, and the Ongoing Complexities of Hope. This is co-host Jen, and in this episode of Across the Divide's book club series, I talk with Kelley Nikondeha about this book. We talk about what the Advent stories invite us to see differently about this story of hope that come to us in the New Testament, and about our own realities, about how we might see Advent as a reality that extends into our contemporary realities and that asks questions of us to reconsider who the good news is really for and what that expects of all of us. Kelley Nikondeha is a writer, liberation theologian, and community development practitioner. She combines biblical texts and various cultural contexts to discover insights for embodied justice, community engagement, and living faith. She's the author of Defiant, What the Women of Exodus Teach Us About Freedom, and adopted the Sacrament of Belonging in a Fractured World. And her newest book just came out with Orbis Press called Jubilee Economics. She's also known for highlighting Palestinian voices and rights, and she travels between the Southwest, US and Burundi in East Africa. Here is my conversation with Kelley Nikondeha. Hey, Kelley, welcome to Across the Divide. It's really good to have you here.
Wonderful. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to chat with you about your book that we're reading for Across the Divide book club this month, The First Advent in Palestine: Reversals, Resistance, and the Ongoing Complexity of Hope. It's such a beautiful title and cover, and there's just rich storytelling, and you're a beautiful writer. There's beautiful writing throughout. So thank you for the gift and invitation of this book. Excited to chat about it with you.
Well, thank you so much. I particularly love this cover, so I hope your listeners will be able to see the cover. It's done. It's my favorite Palestinian artist, Slimane Mansour, and it was important to me to have a Palestinian artist actually on the front. So that means a lot to me.
Yeah. His work is so beautiful. And I love this cover. So maybe, Kelley, to start off, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about what led to you writing this book. You talk about in the introduction that over time for you, the Christmas story had been diluted or it had become something else. It didn't hold its same meaning. And you were kind of searching for something more, something deeper in it. And it sounds like maybe there's more of a story there or some convergences in your own life and experiences in faith. I'm wondering if you might share about that, of what was really kind of underneath what led to this book project.
Well, I think there really was a growing dissonance between the Advent story and Advent as I had experienced it growing up, and the realities of the world that I was becoming more and more acquainted with. Right. So maybe some of that is just kind of a coming of age story in terms of my faith. But the dissonance became louder and louder and harder for me to ignore. And I thought the only way I'm going to possibly kind of redeem or resurrect Advent and the Christmas narratives is probably going to be by jumping deep into the story itself. And so that really is a bit of what I did. And I think I had a deep sense that there is something I am missing,
Hmm.
because I've always known scripture to be true. True in the sense that it is a true reflection of how people have always grappled with faith, grappled with their understanding of God, grappling with the empires and the world that they were in. Like, it's always been a true reflection. And so I'm like, the Advent stories, they have to somehow be more true than I'm giving them credit for,
Hmm.
or that I have been given. And so I guess there was a sense of, I'm going to take the text to task and see if it holds up. Um, and if it holds up, then I will be closer to a star that I can, can really look to. And so, yeah, it was just jumping in and saying, there's got to be more here. It's got to somehow reflect the world that I'm living in if it's going to remain true. So.
I love that. I love the way that you talk about scripture being true and kind of manifesting in kind of new meaning and light in what we're experiencing in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if you, maybe at this point in time in your faith journey and your community, if you felt like you had the freedom to explore the layers of the story, the layers of scripture beyond what you had learned of the Advent story in church. I know you mentioned throughout kind of your rootedness in the evangelical tradition, and the particular kind of Advent story you learned,
right?
Which then oftentimes gets conflated with a sort of like American consumerism, unfortunately, oftentimes in our churches, and it involves a lot of seasonal treats and lights and trees and gifts, sometimes more than the subversive part of the story that you really detail so much in the book, which we'll get to. But I'm curious if it felt like did you have that space within your community to do that kind of work, which is in some ways to say there's another story here that I haven't learned, that I haven't been told.
Well, I have, I think, grown or pulled back from the evangelical community that I grew up in quite some time ago. I think I found that articulation of faith just wasn't serving me well.
Yeah.
I don't think it's serving my country well, if I'm honest. But that had been happening for quite some time. So I actually did feel within my small community, especially my community of fellow writers and thinkers and fellow theologians, I did feel in that space safe enough to go where the text took me. And for me, the text includes, yes, I meditate on scripture. That's one thing I do keep from my evangelical upbringing, is that coming back to the story again and again and again and letting it open up to me over time. But I also include scholarship and archaeology, and I include those things as other truth tellers that then corroborate and kind of sing together with the text, right? And so I think that's where I felt like things started to really sing for me again, when those things started coming together. And I think the chapter on Mary is one example where that certainly is beyond most of the traditions that I am part of or have been part of. But I think, that unlocked some things for me when I realized what was happening historically, what is going on in the terrain, what might Mary's life have really looked like. It came together. It's like, oh, she is so much more than I ever realized. And I love her for that. And I think she has so much more to give us, especially as women, when we understand more of the complexity of her world and who she probably was up against a really hard terrain. So I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah. I love that. And it's, yes, I feel like tapping into some of that of what you get into in your chapter on Mary, it becomes a little clearer of like, oh, this is why there are centuries and centuries of traditions that have really centered the real, like, beautiful and divine work that Mary has played
Yes.
in the Christian faith, but certainly in the sort of the shepherding, the midwifery of incarnation with her own body and her own
Yes.
experience and raising her son.
Yes.
You mentioned this is like a rabbit trail, but I want to take it because it's about Mary, and you just
Okay.
said, like, as women, this is like it's such an important place for us to connect to in the story.
Mm.
You mentioned, kind of disclosed later on in the book, that you are a mother yourself.
Yes.
I'm just curious how if that played in at all to your relationship to Mary as you were doing this research in all these different areas and then composing this chapter and writing about her story in a really different way.
Mm. I mean, I think what really got me was actually more of a connection, not to my own children. Um, as an adopted, I adopted my children, and so I think it's the women in the Exodus narrative, those mothers, that
Mm.
really kind of sync up and have really informed my understanding of that liberation narrative, and have then informed my parenting of my own children, right? It's gone both ways. My lived experience has helped me see something in those Exodus women, the birth mother and the adoptive mother. But those women have also helped me be a better mother to my children as bicultural children. So that story, I think I was looking more to ahead to Mimi, who is a young woman in Palestine who is known for her activism and has been imprisoned, really harassed and then imprisoned by the state of Israel. And she really was, I mean, maybe muse is the wrong word, but she gave me a picture of what Mary was probably like. And so there was something it's like I could not take my eyes off of her and what
Mm.
was happening in her story and her village in real time as I was writing the Mary chapter. So that's actually, she opened up some things in terms of the texture of understanding Mary that I had never seen before. So.
Mm. That's beautiful. Yeah, I love the way that you weave in Ahead to Mimi's story. And I mean, in some ways, it really sort of, it's a moment in the book where you do this in every chapter, really, Kelley, where you talk about the imperial context of both the stories that are often untold in Christian churches leading up to this time that Luke and Matthew are starting at when they start these kind of narratives of Jesus's birth and his lineage. You talk about the time of the Maccabees and the Jewish revolt, and this long history that is often left out in Christian teaching. But then throughout the chapters, you share the stories of Palestinians, either who you've met, folks you've built friendships with, the incredible stories of young women that you've come across as a way to really give roots and in some ways offer us an image, a context to think with about the real sort of danger and stakes of the context of ancient Judea under Roman rule. And so I really like the way that you do that with her story, and with so many others. But yeah, I'm wondering maybe if you can talk to us a little bit more about this. You are like peeling back the layers, showing how imperial occupation, violence, trauma are all throughout these Advent stories and subversive storytelling. Talk to me about that. And why do these pieces of the context matter?
Well,
how do they inform how we read these stories?
I think without recognizing the context, it's very easy to sanitize, smooth out the story, to make it easier for us, especially in our, commercialized, materialistic context. It's easier to kind of do that when you don't recognize, there was a military violence, there was an economic violence. These people were in a vice grip. They were struggling with indebtedness and stigma and I think that the more you get it, you start. First of all, I hope people recognize some of these things actually sound really reminiscent to the news, right? Some of this actually doesn't, whether they know anything about the Middle East and know anything about Palestine, and they're like, whoa, or they just are looking around in our current context and the ways in which our economy is impinging upon people, or the ways in which families are being separated, or refugees are being accepted or not accepted. Like, you can just even look domestically and say, oh, that was happening then, but it actually feels like it's still happening now. And so somehow it closes. I think knowing all of those details helps us close the distance and kind of get into the headspace where we're like, okay, I can see how this would be good news. I could see how this would be a challenge. Like, we can get there when we can close that distance. And I think the more we understand the world, the more we see that we're still in that narrative.
Yeah, I love that. I love the way you talk about closing the distance. So then you write about this good news beginning in chapter 2, right? And you say some pretty some pretty spicy things about it. You say that this good news that is proclaimed at the beginning of Luke's gospel is only good news for those who are poor and downtrodden. And you're starting to get at that a little bit here with drawing some connections of ways we can see, even just in the US context, that our own political system is one that's on a systematic level dealing immense violence and harm to so many families, to so many people. But not for everyone, arguably. And so what does that mean for the Advent story for those who are not the poor and the downtrodden? And is that part of the point, do you think, for the authors and maybe some of the reasoning for it to be in this book of sacred scripture?
If you think the conversations we are having are necessary, then I invite you to consider becoming a monthly Patreon supporter of the podcast on patreon.com/across the divide. By sustaining our work, you also get access to various kinds of premium content like extended episode conversations, merch discounts, and private meetings with the hosts of the podcast and other Patreon supporters. So help us to continue growing our small podcast and join the beautiful community of Across the Divide by signing up at patreon.com/across the divide.
I think that it's always good to remember when we are dealing with biblical literature that these are stories that for the most part are written from below. They are written under the thumb of an oppressor. They are written by the people who are the oppressed in their time, from the margins of their day. And so when we talk about good news, that, to me, that's always the frame, is that these are people who were under the thumb of Rome, at least in the Advent story. And so they're writing with that realization and that frame of mind. And so what is good news for us who are under Rome's, and have that yoke, that imperial yoke on us? And that is what they are wanting to articulate. That is what shapes their theological horizon. So when I say that this is about good news for the poor, it's because that's what the literature dictates. That's why they were writing. That's why the gospel writers wanted to articulate what was happening in the early days as they understood, the story of Jesus and the birth of Jesus. But I also do think there is something, because I also work a lot with the Jubilee texts, which have to do, again, with good news for the poor.
Mm-hmm.
And the flip side of that is hard news for those that are already well off, for those that are already making it, that have found their way to not just survive, but who have maybe been a little co-opted by, found their way to benefit from the powers that be, the system that is. They don't need the same kind of good news that the downtrodden need. And so I think the Advent message I think it should shake those of us that are comfortable, those of us that are making it. I think we should be shook, because I think then the invitation for us is, am I in bed with the empire? Am I too comfortable? Am I like that rich young ruler who was doing well enough? And in that day, you wouldn't have been rich if you weren't somehow scheming or kind of found your way to work with the Roman Empire to kind of get a little bit of a benefit. Like, right, am I a little too close to the empire for the good of my own discipleship, for the good of my neighbors? And do I need to reevaluate my social location so that I'm more aligned with my neighbors who are trying to survive? And I think, then there's the invitation, because I think I know a lot of people who are doing well, or at least living a viable life, right? They can pay their bills. They're not they're not the ones feeling the pinch of discrimination. They're not the ones who are afraid of ICE coming and taking them or their loved ones off the street. But so they're doing well enough. And I think, maybe you would look at them and say, well, but they also still have struggles and still want good news. And I think, yes, it's hard news, but if you are doing the work, maybe it's the invitation, to now, how can I better partner with, right? How do I recognize I'm in a better position, but now how do I lean in and leverage that for the sake of others? So again, I'll go back to the Jubilee texts, which to me kind of play well with some of these Advent stories, and the idea that maybe I'm doing well financially, but I can give back. I can forgive some debts so that other people aren't struggling with indebtedness. I can maybe even afford to give some things back, to people so that they can make it. And that gets to be my way of contributing to the health of my neighborhood. So I think I'm never going to shy away from saying good news for the poor is often really hard news for the well-off. But I do think there's also an invitation for us. But not without soul searching, not without deep evaluation, and our own kind of Advent reckoning, maybe.
Yeah, I love that. And I think you write about this in a really poignantly challenging way in the book, where you draw the comparison between the Pax Romana and then this other phrase that you use, the Pax Americana. And you're sort of comparing empires that present a sort of rule or a reign of peace, which is really a false peace, and one that's rooted in systemic injustice, oftentimes economic injustice, as is the case in the Advent story, certainly the case in the context of the United States.
Yes.
And so even just with something like that, you're inviting us to consider this comfortable kind of space, a space where we might feel a kind of peace, but a peace which Reverend Dr. King talks about as like a negative peace, right? The absence of violence, but not the presence of justice. And So I'm curious to hear how you talk about this in relation to churches. I mean, you've just put out this beautiful new book on Jubilee economics, and I can hear the way that you're talking about how we evaluate our own positionalities in relation to this really radical redistribution of power that we see in the Advent stories, that we see in texts on Jubilee. How maybe how do you where do you see opportunities for churches to interrogate this, and maybe through the Advent story, and or missed opportunities, ways that the church doesn't engage with these hard and uncomfortable questions that the story itself, you're saying is asking of us?
Yes. Well, I think that, and I do want to say, I feel like there are more people that are addressing a little more honestly through some people often will call it Blue Christmas, right? The conversations around the things that are painful or hard around the holidays. And I know people who've done really good work in trying to create spaces within church communities for people to be able to express that while you guys have a tree and twinkling lights and decked halls, there are still people who are mourning, the loss of somebody at their table, the loss of somebody next to them in bed, the loss of, and I appreciate, my friends who are doing that work and making church a little bit safer for people who are in crisis or in deep sadness during the holiday. But I think the Advent story isn't so much the sadness is injustice. The sadness and the loss that Advent puts before us is we are losing people because of the empire, because of its economic violence, because of its military violence, and that is a certain kind of loss. And I think, so for me, Advent invites us to really, even as church communities, grapple with the ways in which our current society is creating these conditions where we're losing people. And also like people living under, I'm in Arizona right now. And so a lot of people in my community are really, really afraid of ICE. They're in mixed status families, or their entire family is some form of undocumented or in the process. And there is so much fear. There are kids not going to school. There are families afraid to go to church on Sunday. Like, this is very real in my community. That is the kind of loss that I think Advent invites us to really say, where are the injustices? What are the losses? And are we kind of entering into the Advent arc, which really starts with lament, right? It starts in darkness. It's allowing ourselves to name what is happening and then feel with others. And so I've had some friends, this book has been out for a few years now, and I have some friends who lead liturgical spaces, and they have found creative ways to invite people who normally we don't hear from the front of the church or from the altar. If you're in a more high church space, are we allowing the people who are testifying, who are leading us in worship, are they, these people who are experiencing these kind of losses, so that their voices and their real, the stakes and the fears that we are really hearing them from people within our own community, and allowing that to shape the way we understand what's happening around us. That one of my friends was talking about the chapter on Zechariah and his silence, and that how his silence opened the door for these two women, a young woman and an older barren woman, two women who normally would never have been listened to, certainly never been allowed to have a theological conversation, right? And yet, because the priest was silent, there was space for these women to do this amazing theological work. And So she did she's a priest in an Episcopal church. And so she purposely had in her Advent, 4 weeks of Advent, none of the normal people, none of the church leaders, no white men. Like she purposely had all the people who were doing the sacraments and the ministering from the front were women of color. They have some marginalized communities where she is. They had people who you normally would never hear, including children, up front, being the ones who were ministering the Advent rituals and sacrament to the congregation. So you were literally hearing the voices we normally never hear from here. And I thought that was a beautiful way to try and kind of enflesh one of the movements we see in the Advent story, listening to people we don't normally listen to and believing their story. And so I think that is part of the work. I know this book came out and then 10/7 happened in both Israel and Palestine, and has been devastating for both communities in different ways. But we talked about, some people had already decorated, for Christmas by the time we were having these conversations. And I'm like, well, what if you had a service where you undecorated the tree? Like in recognition that things are not okay in Bethlehem, that things are not okay in the very land where Jesus was born. What if we did, in recognition, we undid that as a way to try and, kind of break through the decking and the lights and all of that and say, well, no, there is something quite stark in our world right now. And maybe how do we invite that into our understanding of Advent? And maybe sometimes I think I'm not very popular when it comes to Advent because I'm inviting people into the dark kind of underbelly, except I think that is actually, when you do that, then you open yourself up, right, for what is to come. But I think that's where the text leads us anyways. So.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that. I mean, you really underscore this throughout the book, remind us this is what the text is inviting us to do. These are the very marginalized voices that are centered in these stories, and then characters that typically are in positions of power or are the decision makers are silent or make room. Zechariah, Joseph, who not only believes Mary fully in the vision and message she's received from the angel, but then supports her in this kind of radical way that attends to her needs economically and socially. I have a friend who's preparing to preach a sermon on Joseph's portion of the narrative from Matthew, and he was kind of struggling with how to talk about Joseph. And so I recommended your chapter on Joseph because, you present these ways for us to understand, I think to get out of the box a little bit of how sometimes we read these stories in the Christian tradition through this kind of straight trajectory, anticipating the end of the story already, and then not really paying attention to or having the right tools to attend to the details that are there along the way that are saying, wait, look here, wait, listen here, something is not going on as it should here, and that's the point.
Or, if we're going to talk about there being a census, for the poor, that always meant our taxes are about to go up. That was like a little revelation for me years ago when I realized, when they talk about a census and people being counted, it was never good news for the poor. So Joseph and Mary would have been traveling down to Bethlehem if and in the logic of the story, they would have been traveling down to Bethlehem, probably having a lot of conversations about how are we going to make ends meet because things are about to get worse and we have a child on the way. And isn't that what so many people are doing right now in our current economy? Prices are going up. The dollar isn't going as far. Some communities, are really dealing with, small businesses and farmers are dealing with tariffs and how that's kind of changing their business. that kind of a conversation is absolutely right in the center of the Advent story, but I have never really heard people preach that. It's like we just totally miss that there is an economic thread running through these stories. And I think we also, at least in the American understanding, we've really harmonized both, right? The two, we actually have two Christmas stories, right? We have the one in Luke and we have the one in Matthew. They are very different. One centers Mary and one centers Joseph's perspective. And, like that picture we have of the creche, that is not anywhere in the Bible like that. Because they take elements from, the star comes from one and the animals. Like it's like that we have pulled and created this iconography around Advent and around this story. But actually, and I'm not even saying that necessarily that's a bad thing for the ways in which we worship. And, but when you actually are trying to understand the invitation of these, what Luke is inviting us into, what Matthew's inviting us into, they're very different things. And even that to me was kind of important, to pull them apart and say, what is each of them trying to communicate? And, we end with, Matthew's ending is dark. It ends with, right, the slaughter of the innocents.
Yes.
Herod killing, most likely Zechariah. Tradition has it that he was killed trying to protect his, John the Baptist, his little John. And so it is a dark story. And I remember wrestling with my editor because when I submitted the book, she's like, I had to have a strong drink at the end of this because I ended where Matthew ended. She's like, you've got to give the reader something more. I'm like, well, I can't give you what the text doesn't give you, right? That's other books who are writing about the life and the words and the witness of Jesus. That's, they pick up the baton there, But yeah, these are really hard stories. These are really hard stories, actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I appreciate your sense of wanting to be no, this is what the story is. And so if that means we lean into lament, maybe at the end of our sort of engagement with the Advent story, then maybe that might be it.
Well, and I think it actually, to me, the way in my head, that story of Herod and the innocents. And this was, like I said, this was even before 10:7. In my head, it's the on-ramp to the world that we are currently living in because the atrocities continue. And when you finish there, you realize, then I pick up the newspaper or I open up my app on my phone and I'm like, there are still innocents being slaughtered. There are innocents being abused. These things are still, I am still in this world. And to me, that was kind of an important, I was hoping people would feel that we're still in this terrain. And in a sense, these stories that are ancient are actually still deeply contemporary. So.
Yeah, I think that's, there is an invitation in that to say, to remind readers that this is not just a story that we get to claim as a part of our tradition, but it's a story that we continue to inhabit and live in some ways.
Yes.
And so that requires something of us, that asks serious questions of us. But you also do something constructive at the end alongside that reality. You invite us to think about this long work of hope.
Yes.
And you draw on the work of Mitri Raheb as he thinks about hope in a Palestinian Christian theological context and others. And I want to get to that in just a minute. Maybe we can end there. But I want to ask you, Kelley, about, so throughout the chapters, you pair the stories of Palestinians and mostly Palestinian Christians with these different pieces, of the Advent story, with Mary's story, Zechariah's, Joseph's. we already talked about Ahed Tamimi's story, but you also tell the story of the Razouk family, a Palestinian Christian family in Jerusalem. You tell a little bit of Mitri Rahab's story, kind of through some of his writing. You tell the story of the Nassar family, who we had Daoud on the podcast a couple of months ago. He's a good friend of ours.
Yes.
Yeah. So you really you talk about the sort of like rich Christian history of Palestinians in the land, and then their experiences and struggle to live and to persist under intense military occupation, and apartheid, segregation with the wall, and so many other forms of military policing and economic constriction. And so I'm wondering if you might reflect a little bit on, for you, if you're thinking about these Advent stories in any different way in this current moment. You mentioned October 7th a couple of times, and the sort of aftermath of trauma for Israelis and Palestinians, but also just the sheer amount of slaughter of innocents, the sheer amount of loss of life and destruction in Gaza, for tens of thousands of precious dear ones. And so I'm curious to hear you reflect on if these stories have taken any new dimensions for you over the last 2 years, or the role that you think they might play now for us, maybe Christians in particular, engaging with Advent at this time of year, and continuing to witness what's happening in Gaza and throughout the rest of Palestine, Israel.
Right. It was a particular challenge to write this book because I'm not Palestinian and have not lived in the region. And so there was a part of me that felt like, do I have a right to tell some of these stories? And yet I felt like I couldn't honestly write about Advent without them either, because that would have felt like erasing them, and they've already been amply erased, especially in a lot of our more evangelical articulations, actually, in the stateside. And so I worked really hard, and it was probably the hardest, not probably, this was the hardest thing I've ever written, because I wanted so deep, I wanted to respect these stories, these men and women, and not steal from them, or there's that thing of I don't want you to be erased. I want to make sure you're part of the story that I'm telling, that I'm weaving, because you are a part of it. But I also don't want to overstep, and tell your story. So it was very difficult to work through all of that in the process. And I think, since 10/7, I've had people ask me, how do you feel, that this has happened? And I almost feel like another wave of that same sensation of, it doesn't matter what I feel. I don't live there. These aren't what matters is my friends who are there. And so I have tried to steer people towards them and how they are experiencing what has been happening. And so when I was invited to do a second edition of this book and to do an afterword that included a response to 10/7, I told the publisher, I can't write that in my own voice. But what I'm willing to do is reach out to some of the people in the story. So I had a subsequent conversation with Anton Razouk, who's the oldest son, tattooing in East Jerusalem. And I reached out to my dearest friend, Tahani, who lives in Ramallah, or outside of Ramallah in the West Bank. And I reached out to my friend, Chef Fadi, in Bethlehem. And so I asked them if they could tell me in their own words what it has been like, and then relay to those of us who would read the book what they would want us to know, or what they'd want us to think, or because it's like, that's not my story to tell. That has to be them. And they were all very gracious too. Now they all come from very different social locations, even though they're all Palestinian, Some of them, one of them has a passport, Israeli passport that allows him to still use the Tel Aviv airport and kind of, travel. One of them does not and is stuck behind roadblocks and daily bombardment of her home and sound bombs being lobbed at her kids when they take the sheep out, to pasture. Like, there are very different experiences even within the Palestinian communities. And that, I think that is part of, like, oh, we need to realize not everybody's in Gaza and not everybody who has a Palestinian passport is going to have the same experience. And some are more strident than others. So my friend Chef Fadi was very clear, like, you in the West have been so silent. You have been so silent. And what I wonder is, how much longer will you be silent while we die? I mean, he was kind of the most strident, and I allowed his voice to be the final one because I think it is a challenge to us, to like, yeah, why have we been so silent? It's not like we're not like the priest who actually had his voice taken from him. We're making a choice. So I think I have just listened to my friends in the region. In terms of the Advent stories themselves, I was given the opportunity to go back and amend or add, additional, to build them out in light of 10:7. And I was like, there's nothing more to say. Everything, I reread the book and I'm like, but everything is already there. This is, as Matthew would show us, these atrocities that just keep continuing. It's another slaughter of the innocents. It's like, it is the continuation, but there's nothing that I wrote that is any less true or that I could really add any more color or substance. It was already there because, in a sense, the Nakba, especially for the Palestinian folks, the Nakba has been happening, all in different iterations, and it continues for them. And so I guess it doesn't hit any different, only that it's another reminder of how deeply true these stories are. And I think the one thing that I would add maybe is that I think the prophets would be astounded that all these centuries later, we are still falling prey to the same vices. You're still killing people over this. You're still starving each other out. You're still creating the kind of conditions that force people to cross borders. You're like, I think Isaiah and Jeremiah, and I think that they really, when they wrote their prophetic words, longing for peace and longing for the new city, I think that they thought there would be a time when that would be realized. Yeah. And I think that they would look at us and be utterly astounded and deeply, disappointed isn't even the word, that we are still making these same moves as humanity and that people of faith are participating, that I do, and maybe that's a bit of a downer, but I think the prophets would be like, I cannot believe you were still doing the same things and that you have not yet grabbed hold of God's peace. You are still wanting both. You're wanting to have enough of Caesar's peace and a little bit of God's peace. You still are, you have not moved beyond that. And I guess I feel that even stronger, that they would just be like, I cannot believe this continues to happen. And in that, I am with them in that ongoing lament and just being utterly mystified that we keep choosing violence and harm. And
it's funny to hear you say that. I taught the book of Amos last week with my seminary students, which is a book of prophetic literature that is a pretty scathing critique of economic injustice under the rule of two presumably peaceful kings in the northern and the southern kingdom of Israel and Judah. And my students were pretty perturbed in reading that. A number of them, they were pretty upset of just seeing clearly like that these are still the realities and systems that we operate under. That in some ways this is the the same kind of structure that our world is really, really kind of molded around, and particularly in an American context. And they were frustrated to read Amos and say, I think he would be saying the same thing now, but perhaps with this added frustration of how long will you keep these ways that destroy the people and do injustice. So
sounds like they're reading the text right if they feel that frustration. You're doing well.
I'd like
in
to think
them.
so. Yeah, I don't know about my leadership, but yeah, I mean, it's encouraging to hear that the publisher reached out to you again to invite, this kind of additional reflection post October 7th. And I'm so encouraged by your response to say, oh, well, that should center the stories of my Palestinian friends who are already throughout the book. And in some ways, I think the way that you write about the Advent story really, I think, underscores your point that, like, I don't have anything else to say, because if the atrocities are ongoing, if the kind of systemic injustice, or like the ongoing Nakba, even, for example, that has not ended, the ongoing trauma and catastrophe that Palestinians endure in the land. If you name that structure, then you don't need to name every particularity of it, every manifestation.
Exactly.
It can be a eye-opening and awakening moments for us. And I mean, I think about Reverend Munther Itzhak's Christ in the Rubble manger scene, and what that prompted and awakened in many around the world. But I appreciate your sense that, like, I've already said this here, actually, that the Advent stories are a window.
This is where they go. Yeah, this is where they point. One of my initial things was, can we get that sermon? Would Matri, would Isaac Munther, would he allow us, like to print in full? Because I listened to that sermon. My husband and I listened to that sermon like 3 times that very day that he preached it. We need to hear it again. And we need to hear it again. And I was like, can we just make that the afterword? But he had already started working with a publisher to build that out into a book, which I'm so glad he did. But I was like, what else is there to say? Certainly nothing from me.
Yeah, there's such a beautiful humility in that. And I think just a real sort of centering again of voices that Christians in the West in particular are less likely to hear from, which is, I think, what you do really throughout the book so well. Maybe, Kelley, as we close, we can go back to this question of hope as you write about it. And if I may, I want to just kind of think about how it is that you think about the relationship between hope and peacemaking in the very last chapter in the book, in chapter 10. And you talk about Advent faith as this sort of continuing or building on generations of hope, which I think is really interesting. And you talk about the incarnation of Christ as this kind of subversive peace, and also like breaking open of hope in some ways. And you write on page 183, Advent isn't the acceptance of status quo peace, but an incarnation of God's peace that we live in the world. The peacemakers formed by Advent are those who resist empire, who practice hospitality with neighbors, and who enter into solidarity with God in the work of liberation for everyone. And you talk about hope as this work, as the work, I think, of liberation for all. And you acknowledged that it's really long work,
Mm-hmm.
that we often don't see the fruits of that in our lifetime, that it's passed from generations to generations.
Right.
And so how do we do this work of hope, of liberation, when it seems we're in times of crisis?
Mm-hmm.
It's really easy to see what's happening in our communities, in our country, in the larger world, and not see any glimmers of that kind of liberation, or
Yes.
to be isolated in our comfortableness,
Right.
and not see the need for it.
Right.
Those are just two like potential scenarios. There are many others, obviously.
Right.
But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, of how you practice hope, of how you how you continue to muster the
Mm-hmm.
work of hope
Mm-hmm.
in the wake of continued catastrophe and loss.
Right. Well, I'll bring it more to our kind of domestic conversation here in the States, because the way that you had kind of framed the question, I was like, oh man, this is where I feel like I tap into my inner Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Yes.
Because
okay. Good.
because I think there's something that he articulates, which, by the way, I mean, his book, he went to Palestine with a group that I only dream of going with, which is the Palestinian Literary Festival. But he went to Palestine with these amazing Palestinian people. And I was like, oh, I can't wait to hear what he has to say when he comes out and he processes that. And that reflection has been put in his most recent book, The Message. And he wrote things that I was like, that's exactly what I felt in Palestine, and I couldn't say it. So if anybody is looking for another voice on what it is like to go into that space, he speaks in such clear, poignant ways. I was like, I felt that, and I couldn't name it. So he's a good voice. If you just want somebody else who, like, from our world, goes there and is trying to get their bearings, he's a good one. But the way that he talks about hope, I find deeply comforting, because he doesn't rush to the shining stars. He doesn't rush to those places. As a matter of fact, recently he had a long form conversation with Ezra Klein. And one of the things Ezra was really frustrated because he's working really hard to get a different agenda politically across the line. He's like, we keep losing. And you could just hear in Ezra's own voice, and hey, I worked on Kamala's campaign. I know that pain of like, why did we lose? Right? Like there's this, and you can hear, he's like, we just keep losing. And Ta-Nehisi was, in response to his friend, because they are friends, just said, but we lose sometimes. And then he goes on to say, in my tradition as an African-American man, right, the arc is long. And so he goes back and he kind of rehearses, there were people enslaved who were working towards liberation, who were doing subversive work, and they died slaves. They never got to see it. They were not the ones who were emancipated, but they were doing the work. And then some got to experience emancipation, right? Some got to experience the Voting Rights Act and their ability to actually go and vote. So, like, we have these moments where we do get to experience it, but there are times we lose. And there are all these times in between where we show up and we know that like he says, I'm building on my ancestors, the work that they did. And all I can do is make my contribution. All I can do is make my contribution to the place in time where I land. Whether that's we're winning, we're losing, we're seeing glimpses of the new kingdom, we're not. All I can do is faithfully contribute where I'm at. And maybe it's going to be my my progeny that will get to see it or will advance it, and maybe some people, and I know Ezra felt like that doesn't give me much comfort. Ezra was very clear.
Yeah.
He's like, that is too, but I find that maybe I resonate with it because it's what I see in the Bible, that these are people who think in long arcs and recognize that if you want to get there fast, you're going to get a pseudo peace, you're going to get a pseudo treaty, you're going to get a pseudo deal. The deep work is always a marathon. It's always generational. And, I think, like when Trump was first elected, the women's movement, right? The Women's March happened and all these, I was out there on the streets, man. I was there. I saw all the ladies with their pink hats.
Yep.
But it fizzled out kind of fast. Because I think a lot of us from my community, and I'm a white woman raised in Southern California, like we didn't have the staying power. But there are other communities. There are indigenous communities. There are African American communities. There are immigrant communities who have a very different understanding of, oh, no, you got to keep showing up. You got to keep showing up. You cannot give up after a couple of months. This is long, deep, tectonic shifting work. It takes time, and I just think it's such a different lens, but I think it is actually more true to the biblical text and to the world that God has invited us into. So I do think the work of hope is generational, and some of us will see moments of it and be able to celebrate those. But even when I don't, I keep showing up. I keep doing what I can. I keep contributing towards, a better humanity and God's kind of peace, because even if it's not going to be mine, it'll be for my children or it'll be for the next generation. And I still am part of that story. So it's a very different way of looking at hope, but it's the one that has endured for me.
Yeah. It's so refreshing to hear you talk about hope that way. It really is that we can't wrap up these stories or our realities with bows or with kind of clear endpoints and happy endings, as much as that helps a book sell. And
right?
Yeah, right. And rather we get to be and have to be, must be a part of the story for the long haul, and trust that the Spirit of the living God is at work among us and among our generations and our children and our children's children, and that we are moving the work forward. Yeah.
So maybe it's an understanding of hope that requires patience as its companion. And I think maybe we have not done a good job of putting hope and patience, hand in hand. But I think that's the way. I think that's what Matri communicated, right? We still act. Hope is an action word. It's a verb. We do it. We don't even know when we're going to get to the place, but we do it. There's this deep sense of patience for people who have lived under injustice for longer than maybe some of us have.
Yeah. I've learned more about patience and steadfastness. I mean, samud from Palestinians than I think I have from anyone else.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, Kelley, it's been a gift to talk with you about your book, The First Advent in Palestine, and also so much more beyond and around and in between the Advent stories and your thinking and writing on it. So thank you.
Well, it's been wonderful to be able to talk together and to be able to be honest and not feel I didn't feel forced to give you shiny answers. I felt your invitation to show up as my honest self as best I could. So thank you for creating that space.
Yeah, thank you. Our listeners and those that are beyond us will benefit from that. So your words are a gift.
Did you like this episode? If so, make sure to follow Across the Divide and share it with friends and family. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, and perhaps leave a comment or a like. It actually helps the podcast to reach more people. To support our work, to get exclusive content, perhaps to join our book club, head over to patreon.com/acrossthedivide.